Most people assume that mountain men just wore filthy clothes and didn't think twice about it. That's one of those romantic frontier myths that sounds gritty and authentic until you actually think about what wearing truly filthy clothing in cold, wet, high elevation wilderness does to a person. Skin breaks down, infections start, wool stops insulating the way it should, leather stiffens and cracks, lice and fleas move in. And once you're far enough into the backcountry that the nearest settlement is 3 weeks of hard travel away, a skin infection or a bad case of trail rot isn't a minor inconvenience. It can kill you just as efficiently as a broken leg or a starved-out winter. The mountain men who stayed alive for years in the Rockies and the Great Basin were not careless about their clothing. They were extremely deliberate about it. They just used completely different methods than anything you'd recognize from a modern laundry room. And most of those methods required almost no water at all. That's what we're covering today. Hit subscribe before we get into it, because some of these old techniques are more useful than the expensive gear people buy today. And a lot of them have been buried under 2 centuries of nostalgia and myth. I'm Jerry Davis, and one of the things that genuinely surprises people when they dig into the historical record of frontier life is how practical and methodical experienced wilderness travelers actually were about everyday maintenance. Clothing care was not vanity. It was survival infrastructure. A man who let his wool rot or his buckskin harden was a man who was going to have a very bad winter. Let's start with the basic problem, because understanding the problem is what makes the solutions make sense. Water on the trail was not always scarce, but water in the right form, at the right temperature, in the right quantity, with the right fuel available to heat it, in weather calm enough to actually dry wet clothing afterward. That combination was frequently unavailable for days or weeks at a stretch. Anyone who has ever tried to do laundry in a backcountry camp understands the core issue immediately. Washing clothing thoroughly requires hot water, physical agitation, some kind of cleaning agent, and time to dry. In the mountains, in November, you might have cold water from a creek, no soap, no time, and temperatures that mean wet wool is going to stay wet for a very long time. Wet wool next to skin in cold, moving air is one of the fastest ways to strip heat from a body. So, the whole idea of soaking and wringing your clothing while miles from shelter was often not stupidity, but an actual calculated risk that experienced travelers decided wasn't worth taking. So what did they do instead? The first and most commonly used method was vigorous dry brushing, and it worked because of the specific properties of the materials they wore. Wool, buckskin, and heavy canvas all respond differently to brushing than synthetic materials do. Wool fiber has a microscopic surface structure, tiny scales along each fiber, that tends to trap dirt and debris near the surface rather than letting it penetrate deep into the weave the way a synthetic or fine cotton would. That sounds counterintuitive, but it actually works in your favor when you're trying to clean without water. A stiff bristled brush worked hard against the grain of a dry wool shirt or jacket, pulls an enormous amount of surface grime, dried mud, food residue, and debris out of the fabric without any moisture at all. Period accounts of fur trade era travel describe men brushing their wool capotes and blanket coats at camp in the mornings, particularly after sleeping on ground cover or after a day of travel through brush. This was not a delicate gesture. It was vigorous, deliberate work, sometimes done with brushes made from stiff animal hair, sometimes with pieces of dried plant material, and in a pinch with a rough stone or piece of bark. The goal was mechanical removal, lifting dirt off the surface of the fiber, rather than dissolving it in water. Here's what most people get wrong about this technique. They assume it only works for light surface dust. It doesn't. Dried mud, animal blood, grease residue, and wood smoke deposits all respond to hard brushing if the material has dried completely first. The critical mistake is trying to brush damp or wet material. That pushes the dirt deeper into the weave and can damage the fiber structure. The method only works on thoroughly dry fabric. So experienced travelers would let a stained or soiled garment dry completely, sometimes by hanging it near a fire, sometimes just leaving it in the sun, before attempting to clean it this way. Now, brushing handles surface dirt. It does not handle deeply embedded grease or the kind of persistent body odor that builds up in a garment worn for weeks. That's where smoke comes in. And this is the part of the story that most people either dismiss as superstition or misunderstand completely. Passing clothing through wood smoke was a genuine and practical cleaning technique, and it worked on several different levels simultaneously. First, smoke deposits actually have mild antimicrobial properties. Historical evidence from multiple cultures, not just North American mountain men, but traditional peoples across Europe, Asia, and Africa, documents smoke being used to treat clothing, sleeping materials, and even containers. The organic compounds in wood smoke, particularly from hardwoods and certain resinous conifers, have documented antimicrobial and insecticidal effects. This is not superstition. It's the same basic principle behind smoked food preservation. Modern building science and materials research has backed up what traditional practitioners figured out empirically centuries ago. Second, smoke treatment changes the odor profile of fabric in a way that appears to have had practical benefits beyond simply masking smell. Historical accounts suggest, and this is repeated across several different cultural traditions, that smoke-treated clothing was less attractive to biting insects. Whether that's the residual compounds, the altered scent signature, or some other mechanism isn't entirely settled, but the pattern is consistent enough across enough independent accounts that it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Third, the dry heat involved in smoke treatment helped drive residual moisture out of fabric and killed lice and other parasites mechanically. At the temperatures produced near a campfire, a garment held or suspended in the smoke and heat zone for a significant period reached temperatures that insects cannot survive. That mattered enormously in an era before any chemical parasite treatment. A bad louse infestation in the mountains in February was genuinely life-threatening because the constant irritation compromised sleep and the scratching opened skin to infection. The actual technique varied, but accounts describe garments being hung above a fire on a pole or frame, sometimes over a smoldering pit covered with green branches to produce dense, cool smoke rather than open flame, or turned repeatedly near the fire to expose all surfaces evenly. The goal was thorough smoke penetration without scorching. Buckskin required more care than wool because leather scorches and stiffens from direct heat much more readily. Let's talk about buckskin for a minute, because it has its own specific maintenance logic that's different from wool entirely. Buckskin. Properly brain-tanned buckskin, of the kind actually worn by mountain men and indigenous trappers, is a fundamentally different material from commercially tanned leather. Brain tanning produces a soft, supple hide that breathes remarkably well and insulates better than it has any right to. It also has one significant vulnerability: contact with water. Brain-tanned buckskin that gets thoroughly wet and then dries without working will stiffen dramatically, sometimes becoming nearly cardboard-like in texture. Experienced users knew this. They also knew the solution. Animal fat, bear grease being the most commonly available and most frequently mentioned in period accounts, was worked into buckskin regularly to maintain suppleness and provide a degree of water resistance. This was not a one-time treatment. It was an ongoing maintenance practice, done every time the hide showed signs of stiffening, which in wet, cold conditions could mean every few days. The fat was warmed slightly, near fire, against a body, in the sun, so it would penetrate rather than just sit on the surface, then worked in by hand with real physical pressure. This is the part of buckskin care that most modern crafters and history enthusiasts underestimate. You cannot just wipe oil onto a piece of leather and call it maintained. The fat has to be worked into the fiber structure of the hide with sustained friction and pressure. Historical accounts suggest This was common fireside work. Men sitting near the evening fire, working grease into their moccasins or leggings, the same way a modern person might read or check their phone. It was idle hand maintenance work, not a formal task. The same fat treatment also served a mild cleaning function. Fresh animal fat worked into a dirty hide and then wiped off with absorbent material. Dried moss, scraps of fabric, dry grass would lift some grease and surface grime in the same way a mechanic uses hand cleaner, or the same principle behind dry shampoo. Not a thorough clean, but meaningful maintenance in conditions where a thorough clean wasn't possible. Now, there was one water-based cleaning method that mountain men and frontier travelers did use, but it bears almost no resemblance to what most people imagine. And it almost never involved soap in the modern sense of the word. Wood ash lye is one of the oldest cleaning agents in human history. Ashes from a hardwood fire mixed with water produce a strongly alkaline solution through a simple leaching process. That alkaline solution cuts grease and breaks down organic material with genuine effectiveness. It's caustic. It can irritate and damage skin with prolonged contact, which historical users knew, but diluted appropriately and used carefully, it worked on fabric. Frontier travelers who had a campfire, which was most of them most of the time, had access to the raw material for this cleaning agent at virtually no cost and with no additional weight in the pack. The method involved collecting ash, packing it loosely into a container or a cloth bundle, pouring water through it slowly, and collecting the resulting gray-brown liquid, which is lye water. Garments soaked in diluted lye water and then rinsed thoroughly. And the rinsing was critical, because leaving lye in fabric will damage fiber over time. Came out meaningfully cleaner than they went in. This was not laundry room clean, but for removing weeks of accumulated grease and organic grime from wool or canvas, it worked. Here's where I want to be honest about the trade-offs, because this is the part survival content usually skips. Lye water, used repeatedly on wool, will degrade the fiber over time. Wool is a protein fiber, and strong alkalis attack protein structures. Historical users knew this, which is why the technique tended to be reserved for serious cleaning situations rather than routine maintenance. Routine maintenance was the brushing and smoking and fat treatment described earlier. The lye wash was the nuclear option, used when clothing had gotten to a state where appearance and hygiene genuinely required it, and conditions allowed for the water use and the drying time. Drying time was a real constraint, and this is another detail that modern accounts usually ignore. In a high mountain camp in October, a thoroughly wet wool garment might take 24 to 48 hours to dry in open air, or it might dry in a couple of hours near a well-managed fire. But drying near fire introduced its own risk: scorching, shrinkage, uneven drying that stiffened certain areas of the fabric. These were real problems. Wet wool held too close to flame can felt and contract in ways that make the garment unwearable. So, the skill of drying clothing properly near a fire without damaging it was itself a practice technique, not something you figured out on your first trip. One more method deserves mention, and this one is so obvious in hindsight that it almost seems too simple. Snow. Dry, granular snow, the kind that falls in cold weather and stays loose rather than packing, functions as a mild abrasive cleaning agent. Historical accounts from multiple northern and mountain traditions describe rubbing dry snow vigorously into wool clothing and then shaking or beating it out. The granular snow particles work mechanically through the fabric, lifting surface dirt and particularly absorbing grease. The snow then shakes out along with the debris it's picked up. The garment may come out slightly damp on the surface, but dries quickly in cold, dry air, and it doesn't create the penetrating wetness that soaking in water does. This method has an obvious seasonal limitation. It only works when you have dry, granular snow. But it's worth understanding because it illustrates the underlying principle of most of these techniques. The goal was never to achieve the kind of clean that a modern washing machine produces. The goal was to manage the material properties of the clothing, its insulation, its flexibility, its structural integrity, its parasite load, its skin contact hygiene, well enough that the clothing continued to function and didn't create health problems. That's a different standard than most modern people set for laundry. And it's worth being honest that it was a different standard because frontier travelers had different options, not because the old standard was better. Don't get me wrong. Nobody was choosing limited washing because it was philosophically superior. They were choosing it because a full water wash in a mountain camp in November was genuinely dangerous to attempt and often impossible to complete safely. The techniques they developed were adaptive responses to real constraints. That said, some of these methods have genuine practical value in modern camping and outdoor contexts. Long-distance backpackers already know that shaking, brushing, and airing wool garments extends the time between necessary washes. The smoke technique, adapted carefully and thoughtfully, is documented as effective for insect deterrence in current outdoor literature. The principle of fat maintenance for leather gear is entirely standard in any serious leathercraft or traditional skills community. None of this is lost knowledge in the sense that it's been forgotten by everyone. It's lost knowledge in the sense that it's been forgotten by the mainstream culture, which went from manual frontier methods to electric washing machines in a span of a couple of generations, and never looked back. And here's what that means for practical application today. If you're doing any kind of extended backcountry travel, consider carrying a stiff-bristled natural fiber brush. It weighs almost nothing, and it genuinely extends the wearable life of wool and canvas garments without any water use. If you're working with brain-tanned leather or even quality commercial leather gear, regular fat or oil maintenance is not optional. It's what keeps the material functional. If you're winter camping and have access to dry, granular snow, it's worth experimenting with the snow cleaning technique on a wool layer. And if you're ever in a situation where fire is available and water is not, the smoke treatment for parasite control is worth knowing. The mountain men who stayed alive in the mountains for years did not do it by being tougher than the wilderness. They did it by being more thorough, more methodical, and more attentive to practical maintenance than most people give them credit for. Their laundry methods are a good example of that. The technique was not glamorous. It wasn't particularly comfortable. It didn't produce perfectly clean clothing by any modern definition. But it kept the clothing functional, kept the wearer healthier than the alternative, and required almost none of the resources that a conventional wash would have consumed. That's the part worth copying. The discipline of regular maintenance with available materials, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that might never arrive. If you found this useful, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment below. Let me know if you've used any of these techniques in the field, or if there's a specific area of frontier clothing and gear maintenance you want me to dig into next. There's a lot more to cover: moccasin construction and care, canvas shelter waterproofing, and some of the traditional wool treatment methods that came over from European mountain cultures and got adapted to North American conditions. We'll get into all of it. Thanks for watching.